Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. Welcome to Books and Books. Thank you so much for joining us. I ask you please to silence your cell phones. Also remind you can take your pictures if you'd like to. Also go to our website, booksandbooks.com. We'll give you a complete listing of all the events we do here at the bookstore every night of the week. You'll see one of our calendar of events out on the counter. This will give you a breakdown. You can also go to Facebook to sign up for our webmail as well. That way you can choose and be very specific and streamlined about what we send you, because you will never be lonely with the amount of emails we send you. But at least this way you'll find out everything that goes on here at the stores. All of our stores, Miami Beach, Bal Harbor, our center, Key West, and so forth. So you can check all of those out. Very appropriate that we are here tonight on the 53rd anniversary of the death of both Aldous Huxley and C.S. Lewis, and of course, the late great John F. Kennedy. Tonight we're very happy to have with us Mr. Roger Stone and Mr. Gerald Posner talking about the JFK assassination conspiracy, or not. Roger Stone gained notoriety with his tome, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ, which was released in 2014 and quickly became a New York Times bestseller. In it, Mr. Stone makes the case against Kennedy's vice president, whom he describes as an amoral psychopath, using fingerprint evidence, eyewitness, and deep Texas politics to make the case that LBJ, the CIA, organized crime, and Big Texas Oil were involved in successfully organizing the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In his New York Times best-selling book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the JFK Assassination, Gerald Posner is dogged in his defense of the Warren Commission's conclusion that Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, who acted alone. Gerald Posner is an American investigative journalist and the author of 12 books, including Killing a Dream, James Earl Ray, and the Assassination of Martin Luther King. In 2015, a Chicago Tribune called Posner a merciless pit bull of an investigator. Roger Stone Jr. is an American political consultant, lobbyist, and strategist, noted for his use of opposition, usually for candidates of the Republican Party. He was a principal with the lobbying firm Black, Manafort, Stone, and Kelly. During the 2004 presidential campaign, CBS News described Stone as a veteran Republican strategist. Our moderator tonight is Mr. Glenn Garvin. He's an op-ed columnist and TV critic at the Miami Herald. Please give all of my guests a nice warm welcome.
Before we start, I'm just sort of curious. How many people here tonight are under the age of 50? Raise your hands. About a third of the room, quarter of the room. I'm surprised in some ways, actually. I have a friend who, every time I talk about the Kennedy assassination, snorts and says, baby boomer porn. And it is true, I think, that baby boomers are, and all three of us are in that group, are somewhat obsessive about this. I think part of the reason for that, a big part of the reason for baby boomers, is that we were all kids. I was 9 years old, Gerald, and you were 11, I think, the elderly citizen of the panel. Right? For a lot of us, for an awful lot of baby boomers, it shattered a lot of our thinking and a lot of our assumptions about life. It was the first experience for a lot of us that things in life could go really, really irretrievably wrong. And I think it left an impact to this day. Part of the obsession, of course, is who did it? Vincent Bugliosi, who wrote, I don't know if any of you have ever seen Bugliosi's book. It's like this thick. Bugliosi, in 2013, said that he had personally identified 42 conspiracy theories featuring 82 assassins and 214 accomplices. And that was before Roger wrote his book, which expanded the cast considerably. The way we're going to do this is Roger is going to speak first for about 10 minutes, offer his theory of the case. Gerald will speak for 10 minutes. And then I will ask some questions I've devised for about 15 to 20. Then we'll go to the audience. They've already been introduced, so I'll skip that part. And Roger, why don't you go to it?
Thank you, and thanks to Books and Books for graciously agreeing to sponsor this debate. Thanks to Glenn Garvin of the Miami Herald for agreeing to try to bring order to the kind of chaos you're likely about to see. Gerald Posner tells us he's just an investigative reporter, and he is a prolific and accomplished author. I find him a perplexing fellow. His books, Secrets, of the kingdom on the Saudi-U.S. relationship in his book, While America Slept. Our extremely fine scholarship into the complicated relationship between the Saudi government and the events of 9/11. So how can a man who is so right about that be so wrong about the Kennedy assassination? Let me go a step further and say I've read his book about the Vatican and their financing. A masterpiece, worth your reading. Fine investigative reporting, I couldn't put it down. So how could a man this bright be so wrong about the Kennedy assassination? Now, Gerald, he's very eloquent. He was a lawyer with Cravath, Swain, and Moore, one of the finest Wall Street, New York law firms of all time. He is silver-tongued. As I said this morning, quoting from the movie Blazing Saddles, he's got a prettier tongue than a $25 whore. As Slim Pickens said of Hedy Lamarr. Now he is a skillful debater, and you'll hear him criticize the methodology and many other shortcomings in the Warren Commission, but he will cling to their flawed conclusion that Oswald improbably acted alone and was, in fact, the assassin of John F. Kennedy. There's a number of problems with this from my point of view. At least 25 doctors and nurses at Parkland Hospital see a gaping wound in the back of Kennedy's head. Dr. Crenshaw, Charles Crenshaw, is among them. Gerald attempts to discredit him, but I believe Crenshaw in his own book, and there's evidence that he is present. This wound disappears by the time Kennedy's body gets to Bethesda. Now, if in fact Kennedy has, as I believe, been hit from the front and the back, it's impossible to say about the throat wound because a tracheotomy disguises whether it is an entry or an exit wound. But there is clearly a blowout wound in the back of the president's head. This is problematic to start with because 2 shots from the front and back means 2 people. Conspiracy. The debate is over and I just won. Secondarily, however, are the chronic flaws in the Warren Commission conclusions. They tell us that Jack Ruby has no known connection to organized crime. Ruby is a button man for Al Capone in Chicago under the name Jack Rubenstein. He's worked for Carlos Marcello in Havana. Gerald tries to discredit that, but they're both connected to through Louis McWillie. And the House Committee on Assassinations in 1978, which really rose because Oliver Stone's movie caused such an uproar about the Kennedy assassination. The politicians, as they said, had to cover their phony baloney jobs and conduct an investigation. They concluded, of course, mob, organized crime involvement in the assassination, entirely missed by the Warren Commission or misrepresented. Now, in all fairness, Robert Blakely, who was the staff director, was a mob investigator of the mob. He was predisposed to that conclusion. The CIA played rope-a-dope with him like a child in terms of hiding documents and witnesses and so on, so he reached half a conclusion. Arlen Specter, who is not only was a very good friend of mine, someone whose 3 U.S. Senate campaigns I worked on, and a man who I had spirited debates with over a martini over his laughable magic bullet theory, was never given x-rays or photos to work with. He was given renderings of x-rays and photos of the body. You have an unsighted rifle, which is a $75 Carcano rifle that no marksman has been able to duplicate the alleged feat of Oswald in getting off the number of shots that he allegedly got off. You have no powder burns on his chest or his arms or his face, which would be There is some nitrogen on his hands. This comes from the handling of books. 3 police officers all independently testified that they saw a rifle that was clearly a precision instrument, a Mauser. 2 of them recant under relentless pressure. The other one refuses. He's ultimately murdered. We know that according to the memoirs of both Cartha Dick DeLoach, the FBI left-hand man to J. Edgar Hoover, and William Sullivan, kind of his right-hand man, both deputy directors, that Hoover suggested to Gerald Ford, a member of the commission, that the description of the wound in Kennedy's back, a wound that was not even found in Parkland, but was found ultimately in Bethesda, had been changed in the draft, contrary to the autopsy report of the admiral who was John F. Kennedy's personal physician, who was present for the autopsy. The shells that are found on the floor of the Texas School Book Depository building are marked by the police officer who has taken them into evidence, but those markings are not found in the evidence bag. There's just too many anomalies here. The point, of course, is Oswald has deep connections to U.S. intelligence. The government hides that for a long period of time, but today it's largely indisputable. That Lyndon Johnson, I say alternatively, is the man with motive, means, and opportunity. A Confederate of Johnson's, a man by the name of Malcolm Mac Wallace, leaves a perfect fingerprint on the cardboard boxes in the Texas School Book Depository building. No fewer than 6 witnesses tell either the FBI or the Dallas police that they see a man who meets the physical description of Wallace in the window on the 6th floor where Oswald allegedly shot. 3 of the 6 say a second man, dark-complected, Mexican, Hispanic, African-American, could be seen. As I will discuss later, I believe that that is Lloyd Factor, and the first man is Malcolm Mac Wallace, a man whose personnel file shows he was in a patronage job at the severance of Senator, later Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, a man convicted of murder. That's why in 1951, where he killed a man in a love triangle with Lyndon Johnson's gypsy, bohemian, lesbian party girl sister. That's why we have his fingerprints on file. He was represented at trial by John Cofer, Lyndon Johnson's personal attorney, and he's the only man in the history of Texas jurisprudence to get a suspended sentence for first-degree murder. I am happy to revisit some of these topics, but it is, I will make the case that Lyndon Johnson is the man with motive, means, and opportunity, and I think that case is bolstered with both fingerprint evidence, eyewitness evidence, and additional motive discussion.
Okay, Gerald?
Go ahead.
Actually, I'm going to use the podium.
Oh, because you want, yeah,
Just
bring
for this
bring
part.
him up.
Wow. Roger Stone is diabolically, devilishly brilliant. He is really, really good. First, he's been practicing for months for this debate. I can tell you, I know that. He broke 4 mirrors, practicing in front of the mirror so many times, but he has been working on this debate. And I will tell you that he is so persuasive. I've listened to Roger. I'm happy to know him. Tricia and I have been very, very lucky to know him. And he could, if he has enough time, make you believe that JFK committed suicide. He has a way of putting it all together. He ties it, and he's got these little links, and it just sort of does the magic with it. I have to tell you that this is the one area, and he's also a good writer. I've seen his book on Nixon, and it's very solid. In this particular book, for those of you, Roger, how much does your book cost?
You know, it's an excellent question. I'll call that $20
Okay.
roughly.
You're all going to owe me a favor because I'm going to save you the $20. Otherwise, we're going to spend it.
The problem is they already have it.
All right. You can buy an extra copy of Case Closed. The thing is that half the book is a fantastic political history of LBJ. It tells you what a scurrilous guy he is, goes into the Texas oil wars. There's stories in there of big oil. And we're not talking about the assassination yet. We're talking about the mob and Kennedy and how the '60 election was stolen. He's got charges. He's got a whole chapter on the sinking of the USS Liberty in '67. Now that may have been a crime by LBJ. It's a fascinating story. I'm not here to defend LBJ by any means, nor Mac Wallace, who he spoke about, who may have been a scurrilous character. But that half of the book doesn't mention Oswald, doesn't mention the assassination or anything else. The second half of the book, when he starts to get into what is the case for him, it's very interesting. If you look back at his notes in the end of his book, he's got, and I know you'll be impressed at this, Roger, I actually took the time to add them up. You have 965 notes, almost 1,000 notes. It's remarkable. 7 of them interviews by Roger regarding LBJ, and the rest of them, what I call a disservice to Roger, because he relied on other authors. So his references are to other books. Books by Mark Lane, the late Mark Lane, books by Jim Garrison and other people. He depends on those conclusions to draw his own conclusions. And you heard that that can lead to errors if you don't get back to the original evidence. So the lawyer in me says all the time the same thing. Present me the evidence. Yes, I think that the only shooter at Dealey Plaza that day who hit anyone was Lee Harvey Oswald. That's an interesting way of saying a lone assassin. That means that if you had 4 other assassins there firing that day, there's no evidence on the x-rays or the photos that anybody else hit Kennedy. The only evidence is a person firing from behind in the general vicinity of the 6th floor of the depository, struck the president, struck the governor that day. Then the question is, who was the person firing? I believe that the evidence, when you examine it bit by bit, points to it being Oswald. And then the tougher question is, did Oswald do it for somebody, or did he do it on his own for his own warped motivation? Now, you heard Roger say a number of things before which are interesting, such as the fact that at Parkland Hospital, the witnesses said that Kennedy had a gaping wound in the back of his head, which would indicate he was shot from the front. There were witnesses like Dr. Crenshaw who said that. So I ask, as an investigator, all right, is that the best evidence? If so, I'll accept that. No, there's better evidence, because all of the doctors who were treating him in the emergency room, all 13, I interviewed 11 of them, said, and they said it in contemporaneous statements, we never turned him over. They brought him in on a stretcher, we treated him, we lost him, we never flipped the president over, we never saw, that's why they didn't know there was an entrance wound on his high neck shoulder. They thought the entrance wound was here on the neck, they did a tracheotomy over it. They never flipped him over, no witness could have seen that. But there's better evidence than that. There are x-rays and photos taken of the autopsy. As bad as that autopsy was, it does provide the best evidence of where the president's wounds are. They show that they only came from the rear. You have to say that the x-rays and photos are fakes, which some people say, and now you're expanding the conspiracy out to hundreds and hundreds of people. So there are problems all the way down the line. You know, Roger said before that no marksman ever made those shots. That's a canard that's repeated time and time again. He gets that from Mark Lane. Mark Lane, by the way, wasn't a historian. Late Mark Lane was a great guy, but he was a defense lawyer for Lee Harvey Oswald. That's what he wanted to be. That's what he would have been had Oswald lived, and he wrote a book called, it was an amazing book at the time, Rush to Judgment, which was Oswald's defense. Citing that book isn't necessarily citing the even facts, so that what happens is those shots were made not only by Warren Commission, as he said, at the FBI in 1964, they were made by the CBS in 1975 when 11 shooters who had never worked with a Carcano before went ahead and shot, made it between 4.1 and 6 seconds, hit 2 out of 3 on a moving target, and then it was made again by the House Select Committee on 1977 when the shooters brought the average time down to 4 seconds. But wait a minute, in Roger's book, he still says that Oswald had only 5.6 seconds for the assassination. Not true. I feel like I went into a time machine and I was transported back 40 years ago when I read Roger's book, because it's the information from the early 1970s. It doesn't take into account what has been done in the recent decades in terms of ballistics and forensics experts who have come in and re-examined the case. They could have proven it was a conspiracy, but they ended up proving time and time again that it was a single shooter acting at Dealey Plaza. Much of the evidence that he cites, the front shooter, I must tell you, the real magic, the real phantom at Dealey Plaza is the supposed front shooter at a grassy knoll location who fires a shot that doesn't hit anybody. Doesn't hit Kennedy, doesn't hit the limo, doesn't hit the people on the other side. He misses the entire thing. The world-class assassin who's at the grassy knoll misses it all. You know, one of the things that Roger still subscribes to, in his book is something called Badge Man. Now, what Badge Man is, this is just one example. You know, I could go through, there are literally dozens and dozens of examples through the book of items cited in good and earnest sincerity to things that I believe are outdated. I could write a book about it. I have actually written a book about it, case closed, but now this is very interesting because in Roger's bibliography, the very extensive bibliography of books that he referred to in writing his own book, he left out case closed. That's very interesting. It's not in there, Roger, so that it might have saved you some chapters. But let me show you on Badge Man, very, very quickly something. What Badge Man is, it's a picture. Mary Mormon was a person, a witness there at the scene. She ended up taking a film that catches what is essentially the grassy knoll. This is it over here. All right, so you can see this is the area where a shooter might be, which is interesting. Then some people in the 70s and 80s decided, let's blow that up. So they blow it up to pixel size, this large. They blow it up to pixels like this, which essentially is could be whatever you want to. And then somebody draws these in and says we've got 3 shooters. They made a documentary off of this. And I'm not kidding you. You could draw this and make a 747 if you wanted to. It's been discredited widely, but he still subscribes to it. Let me tell you 2 very quick things. He talked before about LBJ being involved, having means, motive, and opportunity. The primary suspect in every murder investigation should be the person with the most to gain. That means that the primary suspect in every presidential assassination should probably be the vice president. The vice president in every presidential assassination has the most to gain. And there's no question that LBJ did a lot of scurrilous things. You read Roger's book, it's a hair-raising account. It's worth it just for that account of LBJ. But he relies on 2 things, and this is absolutely critical. Roger says in his book, by the way, and I'm quoting him from this section, quote, rather than speculation or conjecture, I have tied LBJ to the murder of John Kennedy through the fingerprint of Johnson's longtime hitman, Mac Wallace. Now, there was a time when that raised everybody's suspicion because there was one unidentified print from the 6th floor of the depository that nobody could figure out who it belonged to. And that did keep people guessing for a long time. We said, who could that belong to? Now, guess what? Roger says only 3 prints found by Oswald. That's the sniper's nest. You can all come up and look at this later. Left index finger and right index finger prints on the paper bag. That's the paper bag in which the gun was brought in and disguised as curtain rods for the day, Oswald. Left palm print on the corner of the sniper's box, Oswald's. The right palm print on the end of the wooden stock of the rifle, the only prints found on the rifle, Oswald. The right middle and right fingerprints on the trigger guard. Only prints found on the gun, on the trigger guard, Oswald's. And the right index finger over here, the right palm print around Oswald's. 1 missing print. The missing print, nobody can, the FBI can't identify. Finally, in 1998, an 83-year-old fingerprint analyst says, I can match it up. I match it up to a photocopy of Mac Wallace based upon his murder conviction in 1951 in Texas. And for a while, Roger could hang his hat on that. Then 3 other fingerprint guys come out and they say, no, it's not, but they were relying on the same photocopies. In 2013, a fingerprint analyst, Gerald, who is working for the association that has to certify all fingerprint analysts, didn't rely on the photocopies. He said they're not good evidence. He got a copy of Mac Wallace's fingerprints for the Navy when Wallace had served. He compared them to a digital photograph of the fingerprint in the box. And today, as I speak to you, that fingerprint is still unidentified. It doesn't belong to Mac Wallace. So if what Roger says in his book, that his predicate for tying LBJ to the mastermind of the assassination is based upon that fingerprint, it was possibly correct until Garrett debunked it in the most forensic digital way. Now, I could go into the details of the difference between the early fingerprint analysis in 1998. It's light years away from what was done in the 2014. They're using 256 shades of gray. The other was black and white. Long and short of it is that Roger makes a very, very strong case that LBJ was an odious person at times. And much of that I can believe, and that Mac Wallace may have done a lot of dirty work for him. Roger knows opposition research, and he can smell dirty politics, and he smells it with LBJ. The one thing I don't think you can hang on LBJ's neck, I know you can't in this case, is the assassination of John Kennedy. Thank you.
Excellent questions. The first one, I guess, will be for Roger, and that is, can you kind of, you want to reply a little bit to Gerald's
Sure.
slide about the fingerprints?
Sure. First of all, he must be being coached by Joan Mellon. There has been an effort to discredit the fingerprints, so I had them independently analyzed. Also, I point to the work of Richard Bartholomew, who's done extensive further analysis. I add to the fact that an eyewitness, a gentleman who I think his last name is Fox, I will have to check, actually makes the mistake of telling the Dallas police that he sees a man who meets the physical description of Mac Wallace leave hurriedly from the 6th floor, from the Texas School Book Depository, get into a Nash driven by a dark-complected man who may have been an Indian. This poor bastard has 6 attempts on his life, starting when he gets called as a witness. There's an attempt on his life in New Orleans when he shows up to testify for Garrison. He moves to the Midwest because he says he's getting so many death threats in Texas, where there is an attempt by someone who actually to fix a bomb to the ignition of his car. Fortunately, he doesn't start the car, but he finds the bomb. He is finally accosted in the streets of Washington, D.C., and the witness is packing. He pulls out a gun and kills one of 2 assailants. Now, what did this poor bastard see that when he came to testify for the House Committee, when he came to testify for Garrison, he was largely ignored by the Warren Commission, it was so damaging. So we have 6 witnesses who see a man they describe as having spectacles, being heavy-set, balding in the window. That's a description that fits Mac Wallace. We have a fingerprint that experts that I respect believe is that of Wallace. We have a man who sees Wallace leaving the building. We have the book of Loy Factor, who not only says he was there, but describes a flat saw that is in fact to the right of the window where the shooter is sitting, according to the Warren Commission photos. So this, of course, would be the dark-complected man who is described by 3 of the 6 witnesses. The ties of Wallace to Johnson are indelible. He's working in an agriculture job. He's a convicted murderer. He is a superior marksman with a much higher grade from the Marine Corps than Oswald, who is a mediocre marksman at best. Now, interestingly, on top of that, on top of the substantial evidence that much of the evidence has been fabricated, the FBI is broadcasting at least 5 times prior to Oswald being apprehended the physical description of Oswald. The Zapruder films, we actually catch them reversing the order of the frames. We're told it's a printing error, and the fact that Kennedy's head snaps back violently is restored. We know that Lyndon Baines Johnson, before Oswald has been apprehended, at a time that everyone believes that the right-wing city of hate and that some Bircher, some Minuteman, some right-wing fanatic has murdered Kennedy. Remember, there are demonstrations. They're handing out handbills saying wanted for treason, which are actually financed by H.L. Hunt, major campaign contributor to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, has been beaten in the street and spat upon a week previously in Dallas. Richard Nixon flies to Dallas and urges the people of Dallas to give the President of the United States a respectful welcome. That's something that he does because Johnson calls and asks him to do it. And despite all of that, at 1:20, according to an interview with Malcolm Kilduff, Lyndon Johnson says to Kilduff, "We don't know what kind of communist conspiracy killed the president." Who's Johnson, the great Karnak? If the world believes that this is a right-winger, but Johnson already knows that Oswald, who is an intelligence asset, who is working on both sides of pro and anti-Castro activities, who easily comes back and forth to Russia. He renounced his citizenship. It wasn't really fully renounced. Who paid his way back and forth? The U.S. government. Why would they do that? He's stationed at his top secret military base. He has very sensitive radar information. He is identified now, many years later, by numerous CIA officials as having been trained in their language school. He has worked as an informant for the FBI. When he's arrested in New Orleans, he gets in a scuffle, quite purposely. By the way, Ted Cruz's father, Angel Raphael Cruz, was indeed there. I will be publishing a paper on that shortly.
We'll get to that in a minute. Let's don't go that yet.
Yes, but just let me wrap this up. So Oswald is arrested in a scuffle. He has one call. Who does he call? His wife? His lawyer? No, he calls the head of the FBI in New Orleans, and 15 minutes later, he's sprung. Okay.
I love being with Roger because he just makes it so interesting. He keeps you on guard because it's impossible to answer everything. He knows that. But very, very quickly, two things. First, I just want to say that he relies very heavily in his book. One of the linchpins of his case, besides the fingerprint, is an event, a social party the night before, at which Johnson's supposed mistress, Madeline Brown, who she says the child she had, a son, was Johnson's, was there with LBJ, and LBJ said to him after he had a meeting with all these people, the Kennedys, they'll pay tomorrow, that'll be the end of the Kennedys. So that was the sign that he was going to put the plan into action. You know who was there? LBJ. Oh, that's not quite true. She said the party broke up at 10:30 or 11. LBJ was in Houston that night. They didn't fly into Dallas till 11:10 with Kennedy. They didn't get to the hotel till 11:50, all documented. They didn't go up to his suite on the 13th floor until after midnight, but that's a side thing. She says Nixon was there. Nixon was actually at the Empire Room that night, walked in with Joan Crawford, guy from Hogan's Heroes who was doing the stage act, called them out. The entertainment reporter from the Herald who was there saw him still there at 11 o'clock at night. You know who else was there, she says? Carlos Marcello, Joe Savella, the mafia don of Dallas, and Larry Campbell was Hoffa's hitman, together with John Conley, who was over in Houston, together with the mayor of Dallas, who was at a social event. It just didn't happen. So that's a problem. Two last quick things. You read Roger's book, he talked a moment ago about Oswald being an intelligence agent because he worked at the U-2 base. You won't find the word Nosenko in there. He doesn't have the word Nosenko, the actual intelligence agent for the Russians who handled Oswald when he first went over. I interviewed him. I have an entire chapter about him. You would find out that they thought that Oswald was useless, and when Oswald tried to kill himself, the second time in his life he tried to do that, they turned him over to psychiatrists who, for the second time in his life, found him with schizoid features. That's, we can go into those psychiatric reports. The other thing is, and I think this is key, in Roger's book, if you look into the index, you will not see under the W, Walker. Edwin Walker doesn't exist. And that's because it's difficult for Roger to explain how Oswald in April of '64, after he was standing in the backyard on March 31st taking the famous picture you've all seen of him in his black suit holding the rifle that killed the president, tied ballistically to it with two leftist manuscripts. He doesn't mention the backyard photos, that the next few days he shoots at Walker. He has notebooks about how he's stalking Walker because he thinks he's the next Hitler. The bullet misses because it goes into and blazes along a window frame, and Marina, his Russian-born wife, makes him move to New Orleans because she's afraid he's going to try to kill Walker again. Walker's not in the book because that's hard to put into how you figure out that Oswald's just a patsy. So just another thing to think about.
Okay, now, hang on a second. That was, you'll get your chance. You'll get your chance. I have a question for Gerald now. You mentioned Nosenko. Let's set the stage for this question a little bit. What was Nosenko's first name? Do you remember?
Yuri.
Yuri Nosenko was a KGB agent in Moscow. In 1962, I think, he began leaking things to the United States, to the CIA, in return for money. This was minor stuff as intelligence goes, but the CIA liked the idea that they had a guy in the KGB, very hard to do, and they encouraged this to continue. But Nosenko went back to the Soviet Union from his foreign diplomatic post, and they didn't hear from him for a while. In early 1964, Nosenko gets word to the CIA with his preset messaging signal, and says, "I got to come out. I have something incredibly important about Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who shot Kennedy and who, as you know, lived in the Soviet Union for a while." Well, the CIA would really rather that he stays there and develops into a spy, but what are you going to do? He says he's got information on the assassination. They say, okay, they bring him out. What does he have to tell the CIA? He says, we didn't have any interest in Oswald. ignored him, didn't pay any attention to him, didn't care about him. He's a dork. Nobody liked him, and the KGB's interest in Lee Harvey Oswald was zero. Now, this touched off quite a war in the CIA, and we won't go into that whole story, but essentially the CIA kept him locked up in isolation for 2 years, trying to break his story. They never did. But the questions about Nosenko remain, and I think they're very germane to your Oswald did it alone theory. Nosenko, as I said, came out and said, we didn't care about Oswald at all. We didn't pay any attention to him. In fact, we know that's not true. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Norman Mailer and his writing partner were able to purchase the KGB files on Oswald. It became a sort of like eBay over there for a couple of years. And in fact, there were extensive KGB files on Oswald. They had followed him, they had questioned his co-workers, they had planted informants around him at work, they had bugged his apartment, they had cut holes to engage in video surveillance in his apartment. They were very interested in it. So that raises the question, why does somebody from the KGB show up 6 weeks after the assassination and lying, say, we didn't know anything about him, we didn't care. To me, that smells. It smells like they were trying to put us on the wrong track. What's your answer?
Well, I think the KGB was worried. The Russians were worried that the right-wingers, the people wanted to go to war in Washington, were going to blame it on the Russians. And they were going to use it as a pretext to go to war against the Russians. And they wanted to draw as much distance as they could from Oswald. No question about it. The Minsk operation, by the way, which Mailer talks about in his book on the KGB, is sort of like the Detroit FBI running an operation. The LA FBI doesn't necessarily know about it. Washington will. Nosenko wasn't in that section of the command inside of Moscow that knew about all of them. But what is known is when Oswald went a month and a half before the assassination to Mexico City and tried to go to Cuba, because this was a guy, by the way, 23 years old, about to turn 24. We forget how young he was. Young assassin. He thought the Russians stunk. He had been there. He thought they had ruined communism. They had turned it on its head. And America stunk. The new revolution was taking place in Cuba. That's where he wanted to go, and he got turned down by the Russian embassy and the Cuban embassy. And when the Russians sent the word back, Nechepurenko is the agent who dealt with him. I interviewed him. You won't find him in the index in Roger's book. When Nechepurenko sent the telex back to Moscow, it lands on Nosenko's desk, who said, that guy's a nut. We dealt with him when he came over here. Get rid of him. And Nechepurenko independently says, I got that message from Moscow and told him to get lost. One very quick thing before giving the mic back to Roger and the danger that entails. I want to say that the fact that I think Oswald did it means that I think that's where the best evidence is. That's what I draw as the conclusion. If you bring me evidence showing me otherwise, I'll follow that and believe it. We can disagree about the same evidence, and I don't deny that there were plots brewing against Jack Kennedy. Today, if you stop the clock, there are plots brewing probably against President Obama, a terrible thing, or President-elect Trump. And if something happened to President Obama while he had been in office, we'd immediately say, okay, who are the suspects? White supremacists, Islamic fundamentalists, anti-abortion people, whatever. You have a list of suspects, and the question is, did the shooter do it for himself or herself, or do it for one of those groups? So if you brought me a tape recorder tomorrow of Carlos Marcello, the Don of New Orleans, sitting around a table saying, let's get rid of that no-good SOB, or of LBJ, saying 2 nights before the assassination, I wish Jack Kennedy was 6 feet under, then the question is, fine, that's your desire. Did you then pull off the assassination, or did Oswald beat you to Kennedy? Because that's what I believe, is Oswald beat all of the plotters to Kennedy. They would have pinned a medal on him. They would have patted him on the back. But just because he killed them, he wasn't their boy. So what Roger has to do is somersaults to try to figure out how Oswald can somehow fit into the story at the same time that Mac Wallace can, and LBJ can, and everyone else. It's a good story, but just stretches credulity.
It's easy. He's a patsy, exactly as he says he is. He has shot no one. The claim that he brought a wrapped gun is given by duress, basically from a government witness who they squeeze, but it's never corroborated. He is the prints that he refers to on the gun. Yes, they are planted posthumously in the funeral parlor. and the FBI agents are so sloppy they leave the black ink all over him. The palm print is actually under the rifle guard, so it would almost be impossible for him to touch the rifle there while shooting it. There's another problem with the theory, and that, of course, is that Oswald has to shoot the gun, an impossible shot for the finest marksman. It hasn't been reduplicated. There's actually numerous sources to that. But he has to hide the gun. He has to go down 4 flights of stairs to be seen on the 2nd floor by a Dallas police officer. And he has to do it 90 seconds because miraculously, the power in the building, which ironically is owned by D.H. Byrd, chairman of the LBJ Finance Committee and one of Johnson's closest friends, has gone out. The problem with that is the Warren Commission has an affidavit from Victoria Adams, who is on the wooden staircase between 6 and 2, and she sees and hears no Oswald. That's because he wasn't on the 6th floor. Witnesses have placed him actually in front of the Texas School Book Depository building, where he said he went to see the motorcade. A claim that is a man named Lovelady by some researchers. By the way, when they call you a conspiracy theorist, that's not a compliment. There's a CIA memo that says anybody pops up and questions our cockamamie theory about Kennedy, call them a conspiracy theorist. I'm a conspiracy realist, or perhaps a conspiracyologist, in any event. So it is impossible. Plus, when he is approached, Oswald is nonplussed. He's not breathing hard, he's not sweating, he's not acting nervous. It has not yet dawned on him that he is the pre-designated patsy with proven ties to U.S. intelligence. I do think, unlike Gerald, that you probably have multiple shooters. I think that the key thing to understand about the notion that the Russians were responsible or that Cubans did this, Johnson says in an interview, we had a veritable Murder Incorporated going down there in Texas. Evidently, it splashed back on Bobby and Jack, but that's not what happened.
Begging your pardon, he didn't say Murder Incorporated
Yeah, he
in
did.
Texas. He said Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean.
Caribbean, pardon me. That's what I meant. I misspoke. But it is also important to recognize that at the time of Kennedy's murder, he has actually sent word to Castro's surprise, through both a French journalist and through a diplomat who was his roommate briefly at Princeton, that he is interested in talking to Castro, which Castro finds amazing, but he is willing, because we're at the brink of war. Khrushchev, why would he want to get rid of Kennedy? He just took him to the cleaners in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where our missiles had been removed from Turkey and Italy in a secret deal with Castro, but the CIA knows it, the Pentagon knows it, but the American people don't know it for 40 years because it's classified. So Khrushchev thinks that Kennedy's a callow young man that he's just taken advantage of. There's no motive here, but that narrative is used to explain.
Can I show one thing here? Yeah, wait, I have to just show one thing. I knew that Roger might say at one point, raise the old canard that Oswald could not get downstairs in enough time from the 6th floor of the depository. I have in case closed. One of the bonuses you get is in the back of the book a series of graphics, including this one, showing how Oswald does it, floor by floor. Roger, I'm giving you this one later, but hold on a second. He is, at the time of the assassination, the Warren Commission had Dallas policemen and FBI recreate those steps. And guess what? Oswald couldn't go down the front staircase because there was no exit to the main Dealey Plaza. He had to go back down the staircase. All of the people who tried to do it did it in a minute and 18 seconds on average. Fast walking a minute and 14 seconds. None of them were out of breath. That's none of them. And Oswald does it in a minute 30. And the woman who says she didn't see Oswald also didn't see Truly, who's the supervisor of the building, and the policeman who ran into Oswald a minute and a half later. She was in after them. Now, key thing, Roger says something else. He left without any problem. When he was there, he didn't have any issue. Listen to this. We all agree on one thing, I believe. Oswald was enmeshed in politics, his own version of politics. He's handing out pamphlets for Castro. He says that day Oh, I heard, by the way, that the president was assassinated, so I decided I'd leave for the day because I figured it was a half day. The last thing Lee Harvey Oswald, with his love of politics, would do if he heard that the president had been shot in front of the building that he worked at would be to leave. He'd be outside talking to people, and what happened? When they did a roll call of the building, he's the only one missing. And you know what really happened when he was approached? It wasn't that he was nonplussed. He took out his pistol and shot a Dallas policeman, putting 4 bullets in him. You won't read about J.D. Tippett much in that book, because that's the policeman killed. Now, if he's a patsy, why does he have to kill anyone? The patsy doesn't know he's being set up.
Okay.
A patsy's going to be arrested, convicted, and never know the train ran over.
Okay. Time for Roger's question. Roger, the best thing, and possibly the only good thing about Oliver Stone's movie was that it did prod the U.S. government to give up a ton of documents related to the assassination. However, there are about 3,100 assassination-related documents still classified. That classification is scheduled to lapse by law in 2017. It would be up to the President of the United States to ask for them to be opened up to the public. You have, I believe, a passing acquaintance with the fellow who's likely to be president next year. Is he going to release them? Have you talked to him about this?
Let me say several things. First of all, Gerald conflates 2 different meetings at the Murchison home on the night before the assassination. There's a cocktail party in the early evening. Nixon is in attendance, according to Charles McWhorter, because oddly enough, in '62, when he is flaming out for governor, one of the few guys who writes a big check is Clint Murchison Sr., who was a major right-winger and Kennedy hater and friend of Lyndon Johnson's. Congressman Bruce Alger is there. The cream of kind of political society is there. That gets conflated with a meeting that happens at 1:30 in the morning. It is much smaller behind closed doors. It is theoretically not only possible for Johnson to have traveled the distance to the Murchison's ranch outside Albany, but it's D.H. Byrd is there. H.L. Hunt is too old. He's represented by his brother John, his lawyer John Carrington. It's a smaller group that I believe is putting the final touches on the assassination. Oliver Stone doesn't help by kind of conflating this into one meeting. I believe that Madeline Brown, Johnson's mistress, who tells that Johnson told her in advance, after tomorrow I won't have to deal with those Kennedys, she says that she is with Lyndon Johnson overnight for New Year's Eve at the Driscoll Hotel. Indeed, there's proof that she is. She is, I believe, his mistress. Also, interestingly, Johnson often used a cousin as a body double. The cousin would die when he's brutally murdered after a story in TV Guide exposing the fact that he's considering being in a paid-for movie playing his famous brother. So Johnson is seen in Fort Worth, but he's not heard in Fort Worth. I think, therefore, the Murchison meeting is possible. To go to your question, and I know Gerald agrees with this, I'm for transparency. If there is no conspiracy, if everything is as we're told, why would the government hold back 3,000 documents on the Kennedy assassination? Why indeed does the government continue to hold back thousands of documents on the Bay of Pigs invasion? Barack Obama exercised his legal authority to bounce those back for another 25 years. It's time for us to know everything that happened here, because the JFK assassination is a puzzle. It's an endlessly entertaining murder mystery. It makes for lively discussion like we've had tonight. But I'm hopeful that the president will do that. Now, I have not discussed it with him, and I will probably bring the question up at an appropriate time. At this point, he's trying to form a government. But it is, he has been largely spoken in terms of transparency, in terms of the events of 9/11. I'm hopeful that he will give us more insights into what has transpired. In the past, when the many government documents were released based on a law passed under Bill Clinton but signed ironically by George H.W. Bush, we got a document from J. Edgar Hoover to underlings at the FBI saying, be sure to brief George Bush of the CIA on right-wing anti-Castro activity in Dallas. Very curious memo in terms of where George Bush was on the day of the assassination. Here's an interesting factoid. John Kennedy is in Dallas, Lyndon Johnson's in Dallas, Richard Nixon is in Dallas, George Bush is in Dallas. 4 American presidents all in Dallas on the same day. What an amazing coincidence.
Okay.
Very quickly. Roger and I are in complete agreement on the files. I've written 2 editorials, I've signed letters to the government, I've been part of a group of researchers demanding that the files be released for a long time. And I will tell you, the government's its own worst enemy on this. Just because I think Oswald did it alone doesn't mean that I think the Warren Commission did the best job. They screwed up a lot of things, and part of that was sealing files for years afterwards. The autopsy was botched, they didn't disclose that. The investigators were the FBI and CIA who covered their own asses, their bureaucratic asses. The CIA was petrified that the Warren Commission would find out they were trying to kill Castro, and the FBI was trying to run from Oswald. There's all types of issues around that. So holding the documents back makes people suspicious. They should have been out long ago, and I'm hopeful that we'll get this last 3,063 as soon as possible. When the CIA released 1 million in 1993, 1 million under the law that Roger talked about, some of them were newspaper articles, I kid you not, with the stamp of classification on it. What moron classifies a newspaper article you can get in a library? Those are the people that work in our government and intelligence divisions sometimes, unfortunately. That's the nature of the documents being withheld from us occasionally, and sometimes they're more important.
Okay, let's start with some questions from the audience. First question, I'm going to address this to Roger, because I know he has some theories, and then Gerald, I think, has some counter theories. So, the question is, have you seen the photographic evidence Frank Rivera has presented, which shows Oswald in the doorway in New Orleans, along with Rafael Cruz, Ted's brother, in August 1963, and at the motorcade on November 22nd, 1963. How can you explain that?
This is an interesting question because Judith Very Baker, identified in the Warren Commission report as an acquaintance, in fact girlfriend, mistress of Lee Harvey Oswald, has said that she was well acquainted with Rafael Cruz, whose nickname was Angel. It is odd that Oswald is supposedly a communist, but he is masquerading at various times as a right-winger. He is listing as the address of his Fair Play for Cuba committee, of which he is the only member, and he has no permission from the parent group in New York. He's using the same address as Guy Bannister, who is most probably his intelligence agency handler. Bannister is a mean right-winger, a veteran police officer, former FBI agent with deep intelligence ties. So that whole kind of positioning of Oswald is at a minimum curious. I have seen computer-generated analysis that would indicate that it is in fact Rafael Cruz. He is associated with anti-Castro activities in that period. His entire life narrative seems to have a number of gaps in it. You'll notice that as soon as Trump raised this in the campaign, and those journalists, those valiant journalists at the National Enquirer, who are often more right than the Washington Post, C. Edwards, John, correctly report this, and as most of you may have seen, Cruz went out of his fucking mind. He melted down, which I believe what was Trump's intent in needling him on this point. It is further, I think, probable. I have a book coming out called The Making of the President 2016, how Donald Trump orchestrated a revolution, and it will be out on Inauguration Day, and I will explore this issue since Senator Cruz incorrectly accused me of supplying this information to the National Enquirer. The photo in question comes from the Warren Commission report. Now, why do people take an instantaneous dislike to Ted Cruz? They are merely saving time.
I'm not convinced that the picture identifies Cruz. There are 3 people helping Oswald hand out leaflets in New Orleans in the summer of '63 on one scene, on one occasion. Oswald actually describes how he goes down and he pays them a couple of dollars, and that's a lot of money for Oswald because he doesn't have much money to go out and stand there on the corner. They're all identified but one, and now people are trying to identify him and they think it looks a little bit like Cruz. Here's the interesting part of this. The person who tells the story, you just talked about a moment ago, Miss Baker, I'm not convinced that she was the lover of Lee Harvey Oswald either. And we'll say that she knew him in the Warren Commission, yes, but she tells an incredible tale. If it's true, it's really something that she worked at O'Reilly Coffee Company when he did. They happened to meet, they had a torrid love affair, but guess what? She was an up-and-coming scientist and had been actually retained by the CIA to help with Oswald develop a bioweapon to kill Castro.
Yeah.
Right? Well, no wonder Castro's still alive. That's what the CIA was up to. But that aside, that's a different thing. One of the things that Roger says in his book, by the way, when he talks about the front assassin, comes back to Rafael Cruz and this whole idea of the Cubans. He identifies the front assassin as, I'm quoting here, no doubt a trained assassin from Operation 40. Doesn't give a citation for it, but Roger knows intelligence people, so he could have heard that from somebody. Operation 40 was the CIA-sponsored Cuban exiles to take back Cuba after Castro had taken it over. So it's all involved in Roger's mind in this sense. And by the way, Operation 40, funded by the CIA, there was an operation in the early 60s between the CIA and the Mafia to kill a head of state. It wasn't Kennedy, it was Castro. They tried 6 times, he didn't even wound him. But somehow the same Keystone cops who couldn't take out Castro pulled off the perfect murder in Dallas. And 53 years later, we can't figure it out? I just don't believe it.
Nick.
Okay, this question is for Roger. I've read that Reuters ran a story that LBJ stopped the FBI or CIA from investigating Oswald's ties to Cuba in Mexico. Can Roger expand on this?
No, what's interesting is that on the one hand, the security agencies, the FBI and the CIA, tell us that they know nothing of Oswald, but in fact, Oswald is important enough for Hoover to memorialize in a memo that a man who was most definitely not Oswald, based on security camera footage, has been making a scene at the Soviet embassy or Soviet consulate in Mexico. And that this is, so Oswald is on their radar. Oswald slipping in and out of Russia so seamlessly, to go back to a previous question, the Russians, I think, are always suspicious they're being played by him. They let him in the country. They gave him a shit job in a radio factory. He's waiting to be a hero, and he has supposedly brought them secret radar information, although he's never deposed when he returns and changes his mind, decides that he is, in fact, a loyal American. As far as shooting General Walker, Oswald says he can't drive and doesn't have a car. No bus goes to where Walker lives. It's in a very Tony area. And why can't he hit Walker? Walker's sitting at a desk, and it's a 50-foot shot. Except for he didn't really shoot at Walker. He also tells his wife that he flies into a rage because Nixon comes to Dallas the day before the assassination. He has 2 reasons. He's got to go kiss Murchison's ass because Murchison wrote him a check for $100,000, and he has a press conference in his hotel in which he predicts Kennedy will dump LBJ from the ticket because the Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Sal Estes scandal, 2 giant scandals Johnson is embroiled in, will cause a stink. He also, once again, asks the citizens of Dallas to give the president a respectful welcome. He is therefore leaving Love Field while Kennedy is leaving. So imagine Nixon wearing his little hat, his little briefcase, seeing John Kennedy coming in and landing in Air Force One. It has to be a crushing thing for him. There, but for the grace of God, go I. He flies to New York. It is only in the cab that he learns that Kennedy has been killed. He goes to his apartment. He calls his old friend J. Edgar Hoover, and he says, Edgar, was it one of those right-wing nuts? And Hoover says, no, Dick, it was a communist. This is the cover story. Oswald's communist identity is essentially created. He is exactly what he says he is, a patsy. He shot no one that day.
I think that's a good place to go into this next question. Please explain the Cuban connection. Number one, Lee Harvey Oswald is a pro-Castro activist. Passed out fair play for Cuba pamphlets on the streets of New Orleans. Number two, Lee Harvey Oswald met with Cuban intelligence in Mexico City in October 1963. That's a true fact. Kennedy was trying to kill Castro, and it would be logical for Castro to reciprocate. So the question is, please explain your opinion on the Cuban connection. I think that's for both of you.
I just want to say that I know there are some people that think that Oswald might have been agitated by the Cubans when he went to the mission in Mexico City and said essentially, I'm going to kill the president in order to show off to you. But the problem with that theory is, when he went back to Dallas, he had no idea that his path would cross with Kennedy. Rogers says in his book, he repeats an old sort of canard, that there was no printing of the motorcade route until November 22nd, and Oswald was returning from Irving, where he'd gone out to see his wife and pick up the rifle. It was too late for him to know that until he got to Dallas that the president would be going by in front of the depository. Actually, that's not true. These are reprints of the map of the motorcade, the 21st in the Dallas Times-Herald, and the 22nd in the Dallas Morning News, and they actually printed the map in the columns on the 19th and the 20th. Oswald didn't know until that time. And the reason I don't think the Cubans had any involvement is Kennedy, in my view, the Oswald that I came to understand, that I presented in my book, Kennedy was somebody who thought he put himself in the history books by killing Walker, although you heard why Roger doesn't think that happened, but I believe that was his contribution to history. And suddenly he has Jack Kennedy given to him on a silver platter. This wasn't a suicide mission. If he had gone in that day on the 6th floor and the Secret Service were there or there was security, he wasn't going to take the shot and give up his life. It was a moment of opportunity. The Oswald that I came to understand could have been in the 6th floor of a building in downtown Moscow shooting at Nikita Khrushchev. He was throwing a wrench into the machinery of government. He was a wrecking ball into the Soviet Union and the United States. And this was the best he was going to be able to do. So it wasn't specifically Kennedy, it was Kennedy because that was the chance, the same it would have been if it had been Castro. But it wasn't the Cubans, I believe, that made him do it.
First, I'll come to your Cuban question. It is not incidental that that the multiple characters in Operation 40, which is a secret CIA operation approved and green-lighted by Vice President Richard Nixon, to reach out and build a relationship with the mob in an effort to kill Castro. The reason for this is because Castro has arrested all of the CIA assets on the ground in Cuba, but the casinos still are riddled with mob guys who can serve their country. And that is an authorized activity. The Bay of Pigs is really, they try several times to kill Castro. They are incredibly inept. Yes, they do try an exploding cigar. It fails. This morphs into the Bay of Pigs, which is originally a harebrained idea to launch an amphibious landing and to simultaneously try to kill Castro. This is an ignominious failure. The CIA blamed Kennedy's failure to use air support for the Cuban rebels storming the beach. Kennedy, in fact, never agreed to use air power, and his criteria has always been that we needed plausible deniability. This has to look like a Cuban right-wing, Cuban refugee operation, not the U.S. government trying to topple Castro. Now, what's weird is at least 4 individuals who are in Operation 40 are also in the Bay of Pigs landing, are also in Dealey Plaza the day of the murder, and 4 of them are arrested in the Watergate wearing rubber gloves. Yes, these are interrelated activities. In the case of Oswald, you have Gerald has raised the question of the route. Well, first of all, it's important to understand that Lyndon Johnson is the one who insists that John Kennedy go to Texas. He's the one who tells Kennedy that he has to heal a rift between the Bourbon right-wing party of John Connally, his protege, who is the governor, and the left wing of the party run by Senator Ralph Yarborough, who hates Johnson's guts and Johnson hates him. The actual route through Dealey Plaza is insisted on by Connally. The advance man for Kennedy, Jerry Bruno, and the Secret Service say, no way, we'll take the highway Too many high buildings, we don't like the roof. And Connolly pitches a fit and says, you'll do it our way or the invitation to the president is rescinded. Having worked for 3 presidents, governors don't tell presidential advance men that. That is why they are driving through Dealey Plaza to begin with. Now the FBI has, the Secret Service has a manual, which I've actually seen, and there are procedures which need to be followed when the president travels. When the car drops below 25 miles an hour, there's supposed to be an agent at the rear axle of both cars. There's supposed to be an agent on the rear bumper. There's supposed to be 6 motorcycle police officers, 3 on each side of the presidential car. The buildings on both sides of the street are supposed to be searched and sealed. There's supposed to be undercover agents within any crowd. But none of those procedures are followed in Dallas. Now, when Kennedy is in Chicago, in Miami, on his way to Dallas, all of those procedures are largely followed, although there are some discrepancies where a black Secret Service agent named Bolden, who I think is telling the truth, talks about a plot on Kennedy's life. They destroyed him. I'm going to urge President Trump to pardon him, because if you look at his true story, I think he was scapegoated. It is therefore, I think, more likely that Lyndon Johnson, who controls the district attorney, who controls the police. You see the reason he's indispensable, despite the fact that the CIA has motive, and Johnson is their paymaster. He's on the secret subcommittee of defense appropriations where their black box budgets are made. He has empowered them, tripled their budget through the 50s, and when he leaves to be vice president, he gets Senator Harry Byrd, a close ally of his, to chair the committee on CIA funding. Harry's first cousin, D.H. Byrd, the owner of the Texas School Book Depository building. Johnson also has deep relations with Carlos Marcello. He's taking payoffs from a man named Jack Halfer, who he later pardons as President of the United States, to protect illegal gambling dens by Marcello in Houston and San Antonio and Dallas. Marcello and the mob have their motive. The CIA is upset about the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, for reasons we've discussed. The mob has given John Kennedy $1 million for his election. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, who is associated with Frank Costello and the New York mob, flies to Chicago, meets the Chicago mob boss Giancana, and says that if Jack Kennedy's elected president, the Eisenhower administration's efforts to deport Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, 2 of the greatest gangsters of the day, will cease. Well, as some of you probably know, John Kennedy is elected, Robert Kennedy becomes Attorney General. He goes after Marcello and Trafficante with an axe. He actually kidnaps Carlos Marcello when he is checking in at immigration. They take him in his Gucci shoes and his silk suit and they drop him in Guatemala in the desert. So the mob's motive is clear, the agency's motive is clear, and Johnson's relationship is clear, and then there's Big Texas Oil. Derek Waterboy in Washington, Lyndon Baines Johnson. But you see, Jack Kennedy has announced his plans to repeal the oil depletion allowance. So the right-wing oil guys in Texas are going to pay hundreds of millions of dollars more in taxes. So everybody who I believe is involved and has an interest in Kennedy's death, and by the way, he was proposing both monetary reform. He was very concerned about the Federal Reserve and paper money, and he wanted to return to silver at a minimum, and perhaps gold for more of our dollars. Nixon would make this mistake in spades later. So he has the enmity of the bankers, the intelligence community, the mob. He's a man with, and Bobby is a ruthless prick when they have power, so he is making enemies like there is no tomorrow.
And if I could just say one very quick thing, next question. Roger's long answer and very interesting answer. It's fascinating. I mean, I love listening to it. What was the only thing missing? You never heard the name Oswald. Oswald is such an inconvenient fact for someone like Roger. He spins a great tale. It's just that he's got to get rid of that Oswald guy, so how the hell he's a patsy. Just look at the facts, folks. Follow Oswald. I'd love to be able to embrace his story. It's a far better story. And if it was real, I'd sell a lot more books. But it's just not the facts.
I want to read this question because it's the first one that has really flummoxed me. I don't know anything about this. Who was the doctor and/or mineralogist who worked for George H. Bush and was a friend of Oswald's handler and dated Jackie Kennedy's mother?
Yeah.
Was this just a strange
Yeah,
coincidence?
I-
Oh, wait, Des Moines show. Hey,
Yeah.
okay, so that is your friend here? Do we know? Do we have a Des Moines Sheld investigator here?
Yeah.
Let's deal with this question and maybe you can say what you know about it. Gerald, why don't you start and explain who Des Moines Sheld was and why we care?
I'll make this very short because I know Roger's going to tell you that Des Moines Shield was Oswald's CIA handler or thereabouts. Des Moines Shield was a raconteur, an outsized personality who was one of the Russian emigres who befriended Oswald and Marina when they went into Dallas. Marina, Russian, spoke no English at all. There were a group of them. As a matter of fact, if you look in Roger's index, you won't find the names for Katya Ford, you won't find the names for George Boulay, for any of those Russian immigrants. You know why? Because they describe in detail Oswald, how he pummeled Marina, how he beat her. Not the Oswald you may think of, the innocent little patsy. How he used to give her black and blue, how when she was pregnant, he beat her so badly that she tried to kill herself at one point, that he said, I'll never let you get out of this place alive. These were the Russians who came to help her. Des Moines Shield, who thought that Oswald was sick, but tried to befriend him and help him along the way. It's a story that's interesting with those Russian emigres, but what's happened is, in terms of the conspiracies, they take Des Moines Shield out of it, and they say he's really an intelligence guy because he knows everybody, including the Kennedys. And then, of course, when the House Select Committee is going
Gerald,
to go and investigate the
I'm gonna
case, he
interrupt.
dies of what is viewed as a suicide. One of the policemen who was at the death scene is here tonight. I've never met him before, but I found out today through the internet that he was coming to this event.
I think we need just a straightforward, factual description of who Des Moines Sheld was with no argumentation. Des Moines Sheld was one of the people who had that famous snapshot of Lee Harvey Oswald holding the rifle. 1977, when these investigations heated up again, an investigator was going to come and talk to Des Moines Sheld and ask him about his knowledge. The day before the investigator arrived, Des Moines Sheld blew his head off with a shotgun. Now, he had been morose and unhappy before that. Roger, I'm sure, is
Now they gotta clean this up.
gonna blow that off. It was not as if just out of the blue the guy committed suicide. However, go ahead now. Go ahead.
If I may. George's Des Moines Shield is a Russian emigre with extremely conservative views, and he has had a number of international adventures and it very clearly has deep intelligence ties. He tries to see Lyndon Johnson, the Vice President of the United States, just prior to the assassination, but when he is in Washington, he's obviously well connected, but he gets a letter back from a Johnson assistant saying the Vice President was so sad to hear that you were in town, but your schedules could not mesh. He clearly befriends Oswald. He plays a role in Oswald's getting the job in the Texas School Book Depository building. But after the Kennedy assassination, he comes under some very substantial pressure, and he writes a letter to CIA Director George Bush. It says, "Dear Poppy." Well, only intimates of the Vice President from the right set of people in Greenwich and up the road in Jupiter call him Poppy. And he essentially says, I think I've got myself in deeper than I thought. I may have said some things I shouldn't say. The pressure on my wife and I is excruciating. Please do something. And Bush writes back and says, "Dear George, it's great to hear from you. I have no idea what you're talking about. Have a nice life." When Des Moines Shield his body is found, he has an Hermes address book which has the unlisted phone number for George Poppy Bush. Now, Des Moines Shield's an interesting character. As some of you may know, Bill O'Reilly claims that he was on the doorstep of Des Moines Shield when he took a shotgun and took his life. The problem with that is that O'Reilly is provably on television in Dallas at almost the same time. The only books out there that are worse than Case Closed are Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Kennedy, which Bill not only didn't write, I don't think he's even read.
We've got with us tonight a gentleman who was a police investigator on the Warrensheld suicide. Sir, you want to talk about this at all?
Do I want to talk about it? You got me. No. I was the crime scene detective at Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. I was the third guy to see the body. I examined the body with our pathologist, and my job was physical evidence. What happened to this guy? That's what I dealt with. I didn't interview witnesses. I didn't speak to anybody. The body was my crime scene. The house that he did it in, the weapon, working with the pathologist, and 39 years later, I'm still convinced he killed himself. Sorry, Mr. Stone. From the evidence
No,
there,
actually, I think he killed himself also.
Okay.
I don't think he was murdered. I know some conspiracy theorists think that. I believe that he killed himself. I think he had reason to do so. The letter to Bush shows that he's under enormous stress about something he knows. And that letter, by the way, was released with the documents in the second tranche required by the House, by the Assassinations Record Review Board.
Okay, next question. And we've touched on this, but I think this gets right to the heart of it. Judith Baker, Oswald's mistress, claims to have met Jack Ruby and David Ferry in the presence of Lee Harvey Oswald. Is Judith Baker credible, or is she trying to sell a book, or is she just crazy? Roger?
I know her quite well. I have interviewed her extensively. I find that I think she's credible on some major issues. Now, many women project a more loving and devoted relationship to someone they have sex with than men might. So, does she romanticize the extent of her relationship with Oswald, who she clearly knew? Were they in love? Did they have? They may have, but it may have been something more casual. There are other witnesses, including a woman who was a waitress at Ruby's club, who saw Oswald and Ruby at the club at the same time. She would be brutally murdered and left on the side of the street. Beverly Oliver, who I saw at a conference last week, who's quoted in Gerald's book, but says Gerald never interviewed her. It says that she had seen Oswald and Ruby, that many of the girls who worked at Ruby's club had. Beverly was a singer. She was not a dancer. And she was also 15 feet away when John Kennedy's head exploded into a pink mist. So she is one of the last, one of the handful now of living eyewitnesses to this dastardly deed.
Something very interesting, and Roger just personified it. You notice the middle person he talked about, somebody who worked at Ruby's club, who saw something that was nefarious and terrible. She ended up dead, murdered. It's the mysterious deaths. People saw something that they shouldn't have seen. They find anybody that they can that has died of an accident, car wreck, heart attack, and they say, oh, that person saw such and such, that's the conspiracy cleaning it up. But now we have two people, Judith Baker, who says that she knew Oswald, she had a love affair with Oswald, she was working with the CIA with Oswald, and met Jack Ruby, who killed Oswald, and also David Ferry, who's involved as part of the mob, and she's still alive. And then you have Beverly Oliver, who says not only that she met Oswald at Ruby's club, but that Ruby introduced her to Oswald as this is Lee Oswald of the CIA. I'm not kidding you. That's what she says. Now, how did the secret government, who pulled off this perfect crime, killed all these mysterious witnesses through mysterious ways, forget about these two witnesses, allow them for 53 years to continue to tell their stories to Rogers and others, to sit down on documentaries, to write books about it, to disclose it? Did they forget that the two women who saw them all together, who could blow the entire thing up, might not be on the list to be hit, but somehow they don't get done? It doesn't mean automatically that they're not telling the truth. You have to go much further to examine the stories. I spent half of a chapter talking almost at one point about Beverly Oliver and her changing stories over time. But it raises immediately the question mark that you should all be thinking about. They sound fantastic when you hear them, but you have to dig a little deeper to find out whether they're real or not.
Okay.
If I may, please.
Sure.
That was a lawyer's trick. The problem here is the sheer number of unexplained deaths. This is a question of simple mathematics. It defies the odds. Now, I believe, kind of like with the Clintons, not everyone who ends up on this list is in fact killed under suspicious circumstances, but I think many witnesses are. I also think that there is intense bullying by the Warren Commission. Read Arlen Specter's bullying a witness saying, I can have you put in a mental institution if you don't recant. I mean, he is brutal in terms of getting people to say what he wants them to say. Witnesses who bolster the government's account are elevated. Witnesses who don't are not. It's impossible for Oswald to kill Tippit because Tippit is killed at 107 and Oswald is at his boarding house at 102. And the woman who they allowed to be their witness admits to poor eyesight, but two other witnesses who describe a heavy-set man and a second man why they're not adhered to. Not only that, but the bullets on the ground are from an automatic, but Oswald is caught with a revolver. We also have Oswald's landlady who says shortly after Oswald arrives at his rooming house, where he is only briefly appearing to pick up a jacket and perhaps a weapon, that a police car pulls up to the front, toots the horn twice and drives away. What's that about? So again, the facts don't add up for the conclusion.
An added bonus in Case Closed is a special appendix, Appendix B, called the Non-Mysterious Mystery Deaths. I go through all 103 of the deaths year by year. Tricia, my wife who works with me, has a fantastic book coming out in January called The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, about a Nazi doctor who almost got away with it all. That's a shameless plug for tonight. She had to do every death certificate. There isn't a single mystery death in the Kennedy assassination. Each one's explained, 103 of them. And I know this was a crushing blow when it came in 1993 because it lived on in eternity. This is the one that takes you through 15 pages of why they're natural deaths.
Sorry, Roger. Sorry.
Well, it is indisputable that Posner has married above himself. And in all honesty, I would have to review the material. But just taking, for example, Roger Craig, the one police officer who would not recant his description of the Mauser, is just one example of someone who dies under suspicious circumstances. Now, in my book, The Clintons' War on Women, as many of you know, there is a list which is floating around the internet, which traces the Clintons' connections to 63 suspicious murders. This is outrageous. I cannot connect them to any more than 45 of the 63.
Okay, next question. I'm going to put this to Gerald first and then Roger can come in. Gerald, explain the question a little bit if you would. How do the recordings of the Dallas Police Department dictabelt fit your theories?
Again, it's late. There's a chapter on this. The dictabelt is just this. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 70s had found a dictabelt of what they believed was a motorcycle policeman in Dallas, that if that motorcycle policeman was in the motorcade, he had left his mic in the on position. And in the 20 minutes or 23 minutes of that dictabelt, if they had covered the assassination, they thought, very cleverly, we might hear the assassination, know how many shots were fired. If it's 4, case closed, meaning it's a conspiracy. There's no doubt about it. Oswald has no chance. One shooter doesn't have any chance to do 4. They listen to it. You can listen to it. You hear it. There's no sounds of any shots. So they brought in a couple of sound experts, Weiss and Ashkenazi, and they listened to it with supersonic details, and they say they can tell where there are sound impulses, and they identified 4 spots. The subcommittee finished its work and used that as the basis to say unequivocally there was a conspiracy in the assassination. That was the headline that grabbed America. It has since been steadily and unequivocally debunked in the sense that they were a minute away. Those 4 impulses are a minute actually after the assassination takes place. You can plot it, you can see how it plays out. We now know where that dictaphone was. It's a long and technical analysis that people argue with all the time. It would have been fabulous if it proved a conspiracy, because as I say, bring me the evidence. If that was the conspiracy that established 4 shots, then I'm in, but it just didn't.
The House Committee inquiry, which grew out of the outrage by the public after Oliver Stone's movie,
Before. The
well,
Stones movie was 90.
essentially, in this period, you are getting pressure to look into the assassination of King. Now, the bad news for Gerald is that I will be publishing in early 2017, The Man Who Killed King, the case against LBJ. I say this because the King family has won a civil suit proving the involvement of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, and the Memphis Police. One at civil trial. So we can recast this whole debate then when I delve into the truth about the King assassination. Just for the record, James Earl Ray shot no one. No one. So, but before we go down to this particular cul-de-sac, what was the question again?
The dictabelt.
Yeah, I agree with Gerald. The dictabelt is too much emphasis was put on it. I think it was misinterpreted. In the end, though, the House Committee was manipulated from the beginning by the CIA, who never cooperated while claiming to cooperate, turned over nothing, would make no one available for interviews. This fellow Blakey, who I think was probably a dope, but in terms of the understanding what was happening, he was predisposed to think the mob was involved because he had been a mob investigator. Marcello is caught in a wiretap in his jail cell bragging about the Kennedy assassination. So they come to this conclusion. They don't tell us who in the mob, by the way. They just say organized crime was involved, and the Central Intelligence Agency can now breathe easier. They fired their first investigator because he's demanding the CIA answer some questions. So I don't put, I think they did some valuable work, but they miss a great deal. The most important thing, of course, is they debunked the Warren Commission's view that that organized crime is not involved.
One last question. Where are the transcripts of what Lee Harvey Oswald told the police officers while he was under custody for 48 hours in Dallas?
It's remarkable. There's so many things about this case that just make you crazy if you're looking at it in terms of angry, and I mean crazy by angry. They didn't record the interrogations, and as a matter of fact, if you look at Dallas police procedure, they didn't record interrogations at all. You think maybe it's the assassination of the president. Somebody might say we should turn on a tape recorder on this. They didn't. They did keep notes, and some of those notes from Curry and that are in the National Archives were picked up, but of course they raised questions because after Oswald's killed, and the FBI pick up those notes, if you don't believe that Oswald did it alone, or you think the police could be lying. So there's no way to verify now other than the police. The police, when they were interviewing Oswald, didn't know he was going, well, I don't think they knew he was going to be killed 48 hours later, so they didn't think there was any rush to put down the transcript. There'd be a trial. He'd have his defense. He'd have his day in court. They weren't, if they were told you're going to see him for 48 hours and he's dead, they would be making a meticulous record of it. So my view is that they screwed it up. They would have been nice if they didn't screw it up by their own procedures, but we don't have that. That's a shame. But I will also say, Oswald, I do not believe, made any confession or statement in there that would indicate that he was the shooter. He was denying it. He was having fun. He had pulled it off. He had that Cheshire grin on his face like he had just swallowed the canary, and he was going to play it out for as long as he could. So I don't think he told the police anything in that sense. He was saying you've got the wrong guy. He asked for John Abt, another name you won't find in Rogers' Index, who was the lawyer for the American Communist Party. He wanted the lawyer for the Communist Party to come down and represent him. Abt never got there before he was killed.
There's a couple problems with that. First of all, notes do actually surface in 2013 that are consistent and appear to be accurate, consistent with his public utterances that he has shot no one, that he is a patsy, and he's waiting for someone. He keeps saying, I'm waiting for someone to come forward. Contrary to the demeanor that Gerald describes, one can see why he can see that he is visibly shaken when he's told that he's been charged with the murder of the president. It is now, the circle is complete. We also know that he is taken in full public view on the police dock to be moved to the county jail, where Jack Ruby guns him down on national television. Ruby tells us that he's doing this because he feels sorry for the Kennedy children. That's his motive. as he explains it. So you can see the footage of Ruby being led down the hall by a Dallas, Texas police officer to whom he is handcuffed, and a reporter yells, "Jack, Jack, how could this happen?" And Ruby says, "It wouldn't have happened if Adlai Stevenson had been vice president." They say, "Jack, what do you mean?" He says, "Look at the man at the top." He says, "The man at the top, Lyndon Baines Johnson." Secondarily, as the Cadillac that Johnson is riding in rounds the curb where John Kennedy is 3 car lengths ahead, there is photographic evidence, there is video evidence, and there is the memoir of Senator Ralph Yarborough saying that Johnson has hit the deck. He's on the floor before the first shot is fired. What does he know that we don't know? Rufus Youngblood, the Secret Service agent, tells the Warren Commission, "Oh no, I pushed Johnson to the floor when I heard the shot." After Johnson's death, Youngblood recants and said, "Well, I said that because the President of the United States told me to."
Well, you're now about to see an old story, and that is the sinister forces of capitalism crushing free speech. Books and Books would like to get about their business of selling you guys some books, so we're going to have to bring this to a close. Thanks very much. You guys were wonderful to stay as long as you did. Great questions.